So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start out with a blanket apology. It is supposed to be me and Lindsay Harris here today, who's the postdoc working on this project. Lindsay is unfortunately sick. You are stuck with me. I will be relying heavily on my notes because Lindsay was half of this presentation and I can't be her and me at the same time. I also want to give a shout out to Caitlin, our amazing master's student who pulled together a lot of the work on this presentation, and Damon, who is also a valued member of our team who's hiding back there and not doing the presentation with me. Because he's busy or something. So just to give you an idea as to what I want to talk about today. In terms of an introduction, we're going to talk a little bit about what a food hub is. And I'm sure for most of the folks in this room, this is a familiar topic to you. What is a food hub, all the different components of it. But there's some really interesting definitional pieces that I want to talk about. Then kind of digging into the findings from the research project that my team and I have been working on, and exploring the roles that food hubs are playing in regional food systems across BC, what they're currently doing, what they'd like to be doing, and where there's some tensions and challenges in getting to that goal. And my actual goal is to get the presentation done in half an hour, which would be very short-winded for me. But because we have some discussion questions that I'd really like to actually just talk as a group about. Plus, it's like a 10-minute walk to get back, and I don't want to miss the next presentation, which is Andrea and Chris, and I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, so what's a food hub? When I first started working on this project, in fact, last year at FABx, we had a team meeting that involved me sitting down with Damon and Lindsay and saying, okay, I've been doing some reading. Here are all the things that I've been reading about what food hubs are. When we talk about like the literature, which of course I'm going to read because I'm a nerd, there are all these common threads around food hubs being focused on aggregation and distribution, connecting farmers with consumers. This, I just got started, you didn't miss much. This whole view of the supply chain, a very values-focused approach, supporting farmers, access to local food, public education, and they come in a range of scales and sizes, for-profit, not-for-profit, different levels of organization. So this is what we found in the literature. And then we came across this second bullet here, which is the definition of a food hub in British Columbia. And just in case somebody can't read that because of the glare, it's defined as shared use food and beverage processing facilities that offer food and agricultural businesses access to commercial processing space, equipment, expertise, and resources to support business development and growth. And so it's interesting right off the get-go for somebody who kind of came into this project without a deep knowledge of food hubs to say that definition looks very different than those definitions. There are different emphasis, different focuses. And so while the food hub literature that was on the previous slide goes back a few decades in the UK and the US, it was 2018, 2019-ish where we see the BC government kind of begin advancing this BC Food Hub network. Initially through funding feasibility studies and business plans, and then expanding to funding hubs. And from a positive perspective, this is a great example of government stepping in where there's an absence of venture capital accessibility in rural places. So 2 thumbs up. The province funded 14 hubs. One has since closed. But again, do you want to draw interesting attention to those differences in definition, because that ministry definition is a lot more narrow than what we saw in the food hub literature. Although it is important to note that the ministry doesn't restrict food hubs to that specific space. That's just where their funding is focused. So they're allowed to do other things. They're just not going to be actively supported. And then when it comes to the emergence of this BC Food Hub network, as a research team, we identified all of these unknowns. We didn't know within the BC context what role food hubs would be playing in regional food systems, what role place-based differences was going to play in shaping the food hubs, and what role the hubs would play in increasing local resilience. And so this brings me to the research project. Basically, if we think of nesting dolls, this is a good analogy for the research project. The bigger project that sits on top of us, the outside doll, I guess, is this North American-wide study of alternative food networks. And so these are any initiatives that aim to create shorter supply chains, more relationship-oriented supply chains, linking farmers or fishers or harvesters and value-added processors directly to consumers, communities, institutional buyers, and so on. This project is taking place across Canada and the US, and our project is one of several. And so what we're doing is this in-depth exploration of food hubs in BC, looking at 3 questions based on those 3 things that I just mentioned that we don't really know. So what roles are the food hubs playing in regional food systems? How are regional specific conditions impacting hubs? And what's the relationship between food hubs and major disasters and disturbances? Because I need a method slide, it's like, I have to. I know not everybody else cares, but I really do. This is how we're doing this work. We have been participating in the BC Food Hub Community of Practice since it started, so attending monthly meetings, presenting, participating in the discussions, listening, all of those good things. We've done a deep dive into 2 of the food hubs through a series of interviews and document reviews and showing up and being general pests, and not really, but just trying to integrate ourselves as much as we possibly can, as well as attending events like this so that I can hear what people are talking about and see what's trending, for lack of a better word. I'm not going to speak too much to number 3 because that will be covered by Rebecca Richards tomorrow at the Grow and Connect project presentation. So if you want to hear more about that, you can show up tomorrow. I think it's at 10 or 10:15. And then, of course, we can't get anywhere near number 4 until we're done the first 3. So that brings us to that. So before I get deep into the findings, this is a landscape level overview of the Food Hub Community of Practice as of 2023. Please note that any graph like this will change the minute that we have the ink dry on the graph because these are always evolving structures. But the 2 case studies that we looked at in depth are included in this. There were 66 organizations that were invited to be part of the community of practice. That included those 14 ministry-funded hubs, but it also included any other organization that identifies as a food hub in BC. And so that could be commercial kitchens, it could be, and it also didn't matter what stage of development the hub was at. So it could be in the idea and development, it could be just getting up and running, it could be fully functional. And so this is where Lindsay was supposed to do a lot of the presentation, so I'm just gonna wing it here. In terms of the type of organization, we have a lot of hubs that are commercial single purpose. That's the 28 in the yellow. And then a mix of kind of like mixed model and the lime green other. I'm an other. That's basically an organization that participates that doesn't actually have a food hub. We just like to be there. In terms of the participants by region, you can see we've got, I don't want to go too far away from the sound, but high participation from Vancouver and Gulf Islands, Columbia Basin and the Kootenays, as well as the central interior. And the kind of the lead story here is not a great deal of participation from the north. And even where we did see, and not for lack of trying, there were food hubs that attempted to get started in the north, and we're having some challenges. In terms of stage of development, the hubs that have been participating are in every stage that I mentioned, from development to launch. 16 of them were operational, but their stage were unknown at that point in time. If I had to summarize that particular graphic it would be that it's very early days. Even of the hubs that were functioning, none of them would characterize themselves as fully self-sustaining, I guess would be the lead story on that one. And again, just to underscore that this was 2023 and a lot has changed since then. This is the landscape that we're looking at. And so everything from here on out comes from these hubs, from the 66 participating hubs. We know more information about those that show up and actively participate, or the ones that we were doing interviews with. But we've been able to gather a little bit through document review on most of them. Okay. So, what are food hubs doing right now? This is and I apologize for the glare, but this is a reasonable list of what we heard from food hubs about the roles and activities that are going on at food hubs right now. Not every hub will be doing all of these activities. The activities that are listed up here include both tangible, like access to infrastructure, and intangible, which would be something like informal business mentorship. There's established services and activities, so things that people are doing and are very good at, or emergent ones that they're just testing out. Sorry, can't read Lindsay's notes. In terms of what we can report out on measurable impact, there's not a lot of metrics that we have from any of the hubs in terms of number of businesses that have been supported and that type of thing, but those numbers will be coming. So you can see that there's a reasonably lengthy list of different activities that the hubs are performing. What we can tell you about the current roles of food hubs is that there's variation, as I said, amongst the hubs. Some of the hubs are very business development focused. They're zeroed in on focusing entrepreneurs, scaling up commercial businesses. Some of them are taking a more holistic community development approach. There's ones that are focused on commercial kitchens, so catering and baking, versus processing kitchens, more the preserving, dehydrating, freeze-dried, that type of thing. The equipment that is available across the hubs is different, which presents the opportunity for collaboration, assuming that you can drive from one to the other. And let's see. And the interesting thing about the equipment is that they try to, but do not always match the needs of the communities for a wide variety of reasons. And we can get into that more a bit later. This second kind of what a food hub is, its role and how it's changed over time, this I have found incredibly interesting. Because operational funding wasn't provided to the hubs, not even the hubs that received the startup funding from the ministry, food hubs spend a huge amount of their time and energy trying to ensure their own existence. And anyone who's worked in a nonprofit knows what that looks like and that feels like. So it's a lot of applying for grants, diversifying revenue, and ever broadening the scope of what that hub is doing. Good, that resonated. From a financial viability perspective, what we're seeing is hubs continuously trying to shift the model that they're using to try and get to that point of financial viability. A lot of hubs completed their own market research and business planning pre-COVID, so that wasn't useful. And so they're now trying to implement all of that in an environment where the costs and the needs and everything has just been blown out of the water. And I guess most interestingly, if you think of those slides that I had put forward earlier of like how the entire world outside of British Columbia is defining food hubs and how the province of BC defined food hubs, there's a shift to go this way. Like a lot of the broadening of what the hubs are doing is shifting towards what is described in the literature for these other hubs. All right. And then I was just describing this at lunch. So if I look at the interview data, and Damon and Lindsay and I spent a long time with our eyeballs deep in this data, if I put up a pile of the things that the food hubs are doing right now, it would be like a fairly large pile. There's a lot of activities and infrastructure and that type of thing. If we made a pile of the things that folks talked about that they want to do at the food hub, that they see as being necessary for their community, where they see opportunity for growth, that's like a double or triple overhead pile. Like the things that the food hubs want to do, the potential, the need, all of these things is very, very large. And it focuses around things like increasing access to local food, comes up all the time. The value chain related activities, again, that shift towards aggregation, distribution, transportation, logistics, access into retail. Disaster response activities, which we heard about in the Fireweed Hub presentation this morning. How can they be a community asset that serves communities in times of need? How can they provide that adaptable space to pivot to support communities? And this reasonably lengthy quote here is that essentially food hubs become sites of potential. And this is a really interesting point, because what food hubs want to do and what they're currently doing are two very different things. Oh, I'm just whipping through my slides here. We also went into the data that we collected and looked through it with the lens of what do communities and regions need. As you can imagine, there's a broad range of needs within and across communities, typically much broader than the function of a food hub, and in many cases broader than even the aspirations of that food hub. As you can also imagine, across places, regions, communities, there's different priorities, perspectives, and pathways. Let's see. Sorry, catching myself up here. I'm usually at least a halfway decent presenter, so sorry. What we tried to create on this graph is to show where the needs of the community and the region and the functions of food hubs meet. And so if we go through that, we've got primary producers getting things to market, so the aggregation, distribution, transportation piece. We've labeled this as emerging because those conversations are getting started at food hubs for the most part. It wasn't part of that BC food hub scope. So this is where we're starting to see, as I said, that those other definitions breaking in. The need for value added processing opportunities also emerging. All the ones in the middle that are the yellow are evolving. So they exist, but they're not always on target, I guess, I would say. So like if we take the need for food sector specific business supports, there are a lot of business supports in our communities. We have fantastic business support organizations, whether it's the Basin Business Advisors or Community Futures or all of these groups. We are seeing some gaps in terms of the supports that they need. So there are business supports, but there's I guess a little bit of a gap between what exists and what is needed, particularly around the food sector. And a huge need for, this will surprise no one, navigating the existing system. How on earth do you find all of the different supports and funding programs and winding your way through this labyrinth that we all end up working in? Early stage supports that are low barrier or minimum barrier, that's where we're seeing a bit of a gap, particularly when it comes to programs that sound like they serve the purpose, but they have an eligibility requirement that means that they can't serve the purpose. They might be like EI tied or something like that. So these are the types of things where where the food hubs are evolving in terms of the role that they play in this environment, trying not to duplicate what the other support services are doing. Where can they add value? Where can they collaborate? That type of thing. And the orange at the bottom, the need for collaboration and coordination, access and equity, community development. We categorize this as established because for the most part, the hubs are really leaning into this role of trying to convene different people, different organizations around food. And we heard that articulated really well a couple of times this morning about being centers that are drawing different organizations, serving different functions together, and how can they help the community. Okay. This is the one slide that I was like, I'm going to put this in there because if people walk away with nothing else, just take this one home. The potential of food hubs is significantly larger than the reality of it. And in some cases, the most important things to communities are not the things currently being delivered at the hubs, in part because some of the challenges and tensions that I'm going to discuss on the next slide. So we've had this ongoing conversation that centers around why are hubs struggling to execute their aspirations? Why can't they get to the full potential? Part of this is just time. Like, I have to acknowledge that right off the get-go, that we're talking about a time scale since 2018. It's not a huge amount of time to get established and working, so that's a big factor. But there are tensions in other components that we need to pay attention to. That top one, I find endlessly fascinating, and anyone who's had the misfortune of sitting anywhere near me when the subject of funding programs comes up, that's where this is. The tension between external pressures, so political pressures and expectations, funder desires and limitations, all of this outside, you need to do this, you can't do that, it has to be done on this time scale, you can't do this, you can do that, versus those internal pressures of what does my community actually need? What are the things that we want to do? There's so much in there. The expectation that these hubs were going to be self-sustaining on the time scale that they were given lacks reality. That's like the nicest way I can put that. And what's interesting is that a lot of the models, the financial models that were provided to hubs are built on this more capital increasing growth mindset. And that's not necessarily something that's possible when we're talking about the levels of scale that we have in communities that are small like ours. And again, to reiterate that there are some highly desired activities that provide huge value to communities that are not revenue generating. So there is, like, within that tension, we're discussing how we present this idea that there needs to be some strategic investment in these hubs, and an understanding that they're not going to function on the time scale that they've been given, basically. I've bled into the appropriate funding piece on the second level. Costs of operating the facility versus costs that users can sustain. If you have a lower mainland scale market where you have many, many, many users, you're going to get those economies of scale. We don't have that. Everybody in this room knows that, which means that if you're taking the same operating costs and dividing it by a smaller number of users, those users are going to have to pay more if you want to cover all the costs. The math doesn't math. Didn't take math after grade 10, just for clarification, so it's not my strong suit. We do see tensions between competition and collaboration, both within the hubs and between the hubs. And that looks like an example of a hub from outside of our region, so I'm not pointing fingers, had a major client user who basically said, I make this product, I don't want you to have anybody else using the hub that also makes this product because we'd be in competition with each other. But the whole purpose of having this hub is to lower those barriers of entry for all of the businesses. It can't just have that barrier to it. So there's how to navigate and weave through those tensions between potential users, and then also between hubs of if, hubs are providing certain services and there's multiple hubs in a region, are they working together? Is there collaboration? There's some conversations to be had around that. The bottom interests me almost as much as the top does. Tensions in conversations when we were talking to people about this more, what I would call a traditional economic development lens, this very we are going to business and business development only. We're going to incubate businesses. They're going to go into the communities, grow, create jobs. And I'm not saying that these are bad things. These are actually very good things. But there was that very traditional focus on that versus more of that community economic development, which is there are other priorities that we need to address while we're helping businesses and creating jobs, which includes, food security for our community, food sovereignty, addressing hunger and poverty in our community. And so these tensions, I guess, between these more, community development, socially based needs and desires versus the more traditional economic development lens. All right. In addition to the tensions that I just mentioned, identified challenges in reaching potential. And so these are, again, this is the financial sustainability piece. When we look back at the community of practice, the number one topic that gets talked about is financial sustainability. It comes up at nearly every meeting. Hub human capacity, particularly if we get back to that when I mentioned earlier, the ever expanding programs and services and what is this hub doing? That hub staff is one person or maybe two people. And all of a sudden, again, if you've worked in a non-for-profit, this is not unfamiliar to you. All of a sudden, you are the expert for 20 different programs, and you've got to manage all of them at the same time. So that hub human capacity and balancing that, especially in small places where in order to even get close to the economies of scale that you need to manage that hub, you need to offer this breadth, but you need to offer that breadth by being one human and still sleeping. Attracting users to food hubs, that's part of that timepiece of getting people socialized to what it is, how it functions, working in a place that you might be sharing things with your competitors. The kind of, I guess, current and potential scale of agriculture and value-added processing, there might have been more appropriate to have that on the tension slide, but what can you do? The redundancy, replication, and gaps in related programs and actors. I spoke to that a little bit earlier around the economic development piece. This is kind of a delicate balancing act where you want a certain amount of redundancy between programs so that you have a resilient system, so that if one piece of that system is offline or goes down, that you have something else. But what we've seen through a lot of the data that we've collected isn't what I would call positive redundancy. We're seeing areas where there is replication of nearly identical functions and gaps. And so this is, again, keep in mind, this is province-wide, so not pointing any particular fingers at areas or that type of thing, but we need to consciously focus on shifting away from that replication and duplication towards that more positive redundancy. Navigation of regulation and legislation, shockingly, that's a problem. It's like navigating the existing system. Things are changing. There's uncertainties. It's a challenge to understand. I haven't been working in this space for very long, and having worked in academia and the provincial government, I find the acronyms in this space more overwhelming than any other thing I've studied. I'm sorry, what? But all the certifications and the processes and everything, it is just a massive amount to learn and take in. And I can really feel that for somebody who's like, look, I just want to make pie and sell them. That's it. It's a huge learning curve. Okay, 30 minutes. Yes. So normally, this is a point where, as an academic, I would put up a whole bunch of recommendations and next steps and that type of thing. Our project team is still doing data collection. Technically, this counts as data collection. Analysis, discussions, trying to figure out how to communicate all of the different things that we have learned, because there's so many different conversations we could have right now. So what I'd like to do is have a bit of a facilitated discussion amongst the folks in the room and talk about a couple of questions that have been coming out of our research. The first one being gaps between what the hubs are currently doing and what communities and regions need and want. And so this could be, differences in services and infrastructure and equipment, or geographic coverage, which is an interesting one, because some of the hubs are regional hubs, but if we draw out what the geography is, there's different. They're saying they're out here, they're maybe a little bit more in here, but they might have aspirations of getting further. So first question is, what are those gaps and how do we bridge those gaps? And I am so grateful for not having to carry this conversation on my own anymore. Does anybody have any thoughts on this? Yes, in the back, save me from myself.